Thank you, Nitin. And that brings us to the close of the three wonderful lectures that we have had, ranging from how neurons create perception of reality using specifically spatiotemporal selection in rodent models, to how the signals generated underlying cognition can be used for brain-computer interfaces, brain-brain communication, and how how probably mathematical models can be used to understand how information is processed, which underlies the signals that generate these cognitions. So I'm sure all of you have lots of questions and comments related to these wonderful presentations. Maybe we can follow the pattern that we followed in the morning sessions. Those who have questions, please come over to the mics on the side and please go ahead.
Hello. This question is to Mayank Mehta, but could be also to Rajesh. Are you aware of Anirban Bandyopadhyay's work at the NIMS lab in Tsukuba, where he has found resonance in gigahertz levels in proteins which are inside tubulins, inside microtubules which are in neurons, and so that he has suggested a hierarchy of rhythmic vibrations deeper within the brain. And further, I think he suggests that much of the brain mystery is at deeper levels and not at neuronal levels. That's my first question. What's your comments on this?
I don't know that.
Okay.
Would you like to?
Yeah, I'm actually also not familiar with that. I mean, I do know something about the Penrose's theory, using quantum theory and so on, but I guess I'm still old-fashioned in the sense that I'm still stuck with the dogma of neurons and the level of neurons being the right computational level to understand the brain. So I think I would definitely welcome some conversation on that maybe in the next couple of days. Thanks.
My second question had to do more with what Mayank defines as the outside, and perhaps in some way you define as new information in your predictive model. So what is that? Is that energy vibrations in the universe? What is that? What is that outside? What is that which causes our predictive model to work, etc.?
In my case, it's pretty straightforward. It's such as certain photons coming in, certain visual scene, or certain sounds, or some smell. Pretty straightforward. No energy vibrations. At least no evidence of any of that.
Oh, yeah. This is Hayagreev from ISER Trivandrum, now presently intern in NIAS here. My question is to Dr. Rajesh Rao. And sir, you had spoke about 6 layers in the cerebral cortex, and usually the information goes from the inner layer to the outer layer. So it is like the inner layers are more designed in such a way that they take up one-dimensional pictures easily compared to the outer one. Now my question is, suppose we have a cube just drawn with a chalk piece on the board, and in my childhood it was like my teacher used to draw something on the board, a cube, and I used to perceive it initially as a 2-dimensional figure, and slowly it used to go to a 3-dimensional object as a cube. Whereas I used to solve the problem and get it done, but when my teacher used to explain it on the board, she used to feel that the cube is facing from another side. So like that, now I need to understand in her mode. So I used to shift immediately back to see in her direction. So does this shift in my brain happen from looking from this mode to that mode, like going inside again to the inner cortex and coming back to the outer one, or just in the outer cortex itself? Is my question.
No, I think that's a great question. It sort of speaks to the broader question of rivalrous stimulus, like having, I think what you're referring to might be the Necker's cube phenomenon. Also, it's an illusion where you can see this 2-dimensional image of a cube flip from the top view to the bottom view, depending on basically the state of your brain essentially. So I think There are some theories to explain that, and I don't know if we can get down to the level of individual layers of the cortex where we can say that's where it's happening. It's probably much more of a global effect, so it's a multi-layered. You have this kind of locking in of the interpretation at multiple levels before the highest level can maybe lock on to this one particular view of the three-dimensional object compared to the lower level view. But I think it's still a subject of ongoing research as to how does that conscious perceptive this Necker-Cube phenomenon, how does that actually manifest itself in the neural circuitry. There's some work done on binocular rivalry, which is related by Nikos Logothetis and others in monkeys several years ago, and there they did find certain neurons in the brain that correlate with when the monkey sees one versus the other kind of other image, depending on which part it was paying attention to. But I think it's still not completely resolved, right? So I don't think we can focus on one particular layer of the cortex, for example. It's probably much more of a global interaction between multiple areas in the brain.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Isaac. I'm visiting from New York. I'm a philosophy student with like a focus on philosophy of mind. And thanks again for all your talks. They're quite fascinating. I guess I was interested, I've been interested for a while in thinking about on the day-to-day, and this might just be a subjective feeling, but day-to-day consciousness doesn't seem particularly neuronal I don't think about my visual cortex or certain spikes flaring in different parts of my brain, except perhaps if I'm looking at an optical illusion or something. So I guess I was wondering in particular how does that illusion kind of play into neuroscience, if you have any of that feeling, or because you're more learned in neuroscience you do feel more of the neuronal aspect, and I guess a sub-question would be, is there some way of maybe meditating or thinking about different aspects or focusing on an object for a long period of time that could actually get you to see more of the kind of raw consciousness or a more fundamental type of perception?
Who would like to speak?
You want to go first? I think perception and there are a lot of things that go on in the brain that we are not aware of. In fact, vast majority of things that are going on in the brain we are not aware of. You heard those spikes that I played, actual spikes that were occurring when the rat was moving. And right now, all neurons in the brain which are active, they are generating spikes. But you're not hearing any popping sounds in your ears, and if you are, go see a doctor. Or you're not seeing any flashes in front of your eyes. So I think many of the intuition that we have about the brain is actually intuition we have about the mind. Rightly so, we have intuition about our mind, and we think it has something to do with the brain, which is also true. But the transformation between mind and brain is by far not really up for grabs for intuition or introspection, even for some of us who have spent many more years looking at those data. So it's tempting to say, the reason I understand this microphone better is because I stared at it, but in some representation, I don't know, neurons fire differently or something. But that intuition invariably fails because it's so different. All the other examples I was giving you, and as well as you brought up in your talk as well, that when we sit down just now and you kind of doze off a little bit, your entire neocortical activity will start oscillating at about 1 hertz, on and off, on and off. You can just stick a little electrode on top of your skull and you pick up that oscillation. But you don't feel it. 1 hertz is something we should be able to feel, but you don't see light go in and out at 1 second. So I think I would say the way I would go about it is to think how fascinating it is that so many of the things that are going on in our brain are not within the purview of conscious perception, and why are things organized that way. It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, so I mentioned about this double aspect information, right, about Chalmers. So he was trying to answer this question. I don't know whether he succeeded, but as a theory that when there is a physical realization, you go to a particular state. Maybe let's say the neural circuitry goes to a particular state. His point was that at the same time, even phenomenally speaking, you are driven to a particular state. Like you see red or blue. So the point is there is a correspondence between realizing a physical state and a phenomenal state. And he was asking the question, what connects the two, and is information something which connects the two? Yeah, I mean, so the question is to look for this psychophysical laws. How do you connect realization of a physical state and realization of a phenomenal state? What is the bridge between the two? That's what you're asking actually.
Like the hard problem.
Yeah. So at least, I mean, information was one candidate for that, but as I said earlier, it was an incomplete theory, and it was not. I mean, it didn't have much success with it, but information could be a connecting thing is one proposition.
Maybe at a phenomenal philosophical level, I think there is a concept of meta-awareness. That is the awareness that you are aware. That's suggested to be a uniquely human ability. On the one hand, as the speakers have mentioned, that perhaps the neuronal firing is, you're not aware of the neuronal firing which underlies your consciousness. But you are uniquely in a position to be aware that you are aware, which is perhaps absent in the lower species. I mean, at least that's what we assume. So maybe perhaps that's one of the things that you are probably asking, whether are you aware of being aware, and can that awareness be enhanced by meditation or other practices?
But in particular, being aware of very low phenomenological, like neuronal exchanges of sorts, like very low systems of sorts in the brain.
We can be aware of the manifestations of those neuronal systems and the networks that act beneath the surface, and probably the awareness of being aware is what we have as a unique ability.
And that would look more as a conceptual, larger kind of.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the brain-computer interface research is a really interesting area to sort of look at that particular question, because just think of it in terms of if I plug into your brain, so pick one part of your brain and say, okay, anytime you activate this brain circuit, it's going to cause something to happen in the world, right? That you can train yourself to generate that kind of activity. So in our patients, what we observe is that initially we'll ask them to imagine moving their hand, and they'll see the cursor going up. But after a few minutes, when they've learned the task, right, when they're getting really good at controlling this cursor, they will say, I'm no longer imagining moving my hand, I'm just moving the cursor, right? So they've shifted from a conscious control paradigm to a subconscious control. Just like as a baby, we would have been consciously moving our body, and then eventually we can walk without having to think that you're walking, right? So I think the brain has, even though you might not be aware of the neuronal firings, we've sort of been conditioned to sort of go from the conscious mode to the subconscious mode. So we're constantly pushing the skills that we've learned and our behavior to the subconscious level, so we can then open up new opportunities for interacting with the world through the conscious senses.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, sir. I have a question to Mayank, sir. So you are talking about brain and space. So with respect to visual information, we are calculating the depth because we are having a stereo vision. Means we are having two eyes. If I have a single eye, can I able to calculate the depth? In the same way, the hearing also, we are able to locate the sound from here, because we have a delay of receiving sound from two different ears. So we have some means our brain is forming some reference point with respect to the visual and audio information. So where would be the reference information will be located in our brain?
I think that's a very good question as to where in the brain is that reference signal. And as you alluded to, like for example, auditory signal, the reason I can tell that there is some sound of camera clicking to my left and not to my right, which I can tell even though my eyes could be closed, is because of the time difference. Now, such calculations, there is evidence that they go on either binocularly or within modality via, like Rajesh was mentioning about binocular rivalry or Necker cube perception and so on. those can occur in individual modalities, but it's not that simple. The stuff that I was talking about was at the level of competition or referencing, as you put it, or interaction between multiple modalities, such as you see something and then you hear something, and are they the same thing? And we do that all the time. If you're watching, I don't know, some old films or old TV, if the sound is out of sync with the vision, then you instantly notice something is funny. You can't tell exactly what, but you can do that. And the mechanisms by which these things happen, they're pretty difficult to understand. And I rushed over it very quickly, but one idea is that some simple circuit like excitation inhibition can actually do this competition. But there are other mechanisms too, such as adaptation of single neurons that can give you binocular rivalry. There are other mechanisms possible too.
Sir, this compression of the data you have talking about. So compressed data directly implies the feature of the information, features of that information what we are talking about. If we compress the data, the compressed data directly indicates the important, means whatever the redundant data is there, is it completely eliminated or
yeah, so we are talking about lossless compression here, so it's reversible. So basically the redundancy alone is removed, and what is you can actually go back to the original data, and the entropy actually captures that degree of compressibility. So if you have a very random sequence, then you can't compress much.
The feature extraction and compression of data both are completely different process.
Well, yeah, feature extraction is one way to, I mean, you can think of it as doing compression, right? If you store only the features, and let's say you're given an image and it requires some number of bits to store it, you could probably segment it out, segment the features, store that, and then do some kind of predictive coding. I mean, you take the difference, take the error, and then code that. So you could do it that way. So
one more question to Dr. Rajesh Rao, sir. All the senses are directly connected to the thalamus, or I heard that olfactory is not connected to thalamus. So thalamus is not central processing unit of the brain.
Yeah, I mean that is true. That the olfactory senses are very old, and I think Jim Barr might have talked about that. But basically, that's an exception to the rule. But there's still a lot of debate going on about the role of the thalamus in computation, in terms of, people used to think of it as just a relay station, but I think the olfactory has a direct sort of access to cortex, but there's a thalamus sitting there in between the senses and the cortex, so the rest of the senses, right? So I think there's still some there's a massive amount of feedback coming from cortex to the thalamus, and there's also pathways going from the cortex to the thalamus and back to the cortex, connecting multiple areas. So there's a lot of interesting, I think, possibilities there as to what it might be doing, implicated in all kinds of interesting sort of theories that could be about awareness and consciousness also.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm Prashanjit Biswas. I teach philosophy and I work with synesthesia. So this is a kind of a general question to both Rajesh and Mayank. There's this raging debate between deep learning and signal processing. Both of you seem to have followed a kind of a signal processing methodology and conducted experiments. But as far as this idea of deep learning is concerned, where learning occurs entirely inside and just responds to the outside, and when we also see that in the inside process of learning, learning is not a measurable kind of an entity, rather it's more qualitative. In such a case, how would you really implement the kind of theory that both of you are trying to empirically and experimentally build up? That comes with the question.
So I think I just briefly mentioned the predictive coding model that I talked about. So this was the pre-deep learning days, right? So deep learning is a word that's being used now to talk about neural networks that have many different layers, and the fact that we have very fast computers now, and Google's shown some amazing results and so on, it's made deep learning be like the sort of big tool that you can use for doing a lot of machine learning and data mining. But I think if you look at the model that I presented, it's basically a multi-layered network that you can extend it to as many layers as you want, And what you end up, so I didn't talk about the learning part there, but when you do learning in this layer by layer architecture, it is doing signal processing in the sense that it's taking information, it's doing this prediction and compression and so on, going from layer to layer, but it's not a signal processing sort of bucket brigade kind of, pass from one layer to the next. It's a dynamical system that's going back and forth, and it's a deep network also at the same time, right? So, in fact, I think it's what we need for the current deep learning architectures is something like the Cortex that is using massive feedback connections during its actual behavior, and it has a deep architecture, and it's also not just a single pathway, right? There's multiple pathways interacting, and as Mayank talked about, multimodal integration happening also at the higher level. So I think the kind of models we talked about could be used as inspiration for some of these artificial neural network architectures, and I think the field of deep learning is just scratching the surface now in terms of the kind of architectures that they're using for signal processing and for processing images or for sound and so on. But I think there's a lot of inspiration that can be drawn if you start looking at the brain, the cortex, to develop the architectures and the learning algorithms.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that we observed which relates to that. I can refer back to papers we wrote many years ago where we showed that these place cells, which seem to have a map of space, that map actually evolves with experience in a very rapid way. In few trials, the map starts out being declarative about what is out there. In a matter of tens of seconds, really fast, that map starts to become more predictive. And we can show through many papers, which you can find on our lab's page, that this is occurring deep within the brain between two areas such as CA3 and CA1. And that's shifting very rapidly. And we believe that that plays a role in something which we actually is internally generated, which is how much distance have I traveled and what do I expect to happen next. So it is indeed kind of stuff that you can relate to and stuff we use.
One little question to information theory. The whole idea of information loss, which seems to be very important in understanding various types of phenomena, including the psychic life of the person as well as a cosmic phenomena, which is irretrievable and irrecoverable in a sense. The loss is permanent. In such a case, Shannon entropy falls into a trajectory like Gödel's theorem, where the theorem cannot explain its basic premises, but just assumes it to be correct. And that's how the length of a proof thing that you have talked about in effort to compress actually leaves out a large area of information or information theory. How would you respond to that kind of a worry that I have?
No, I think, in the case of loss, there is a separate rate distortion theory which actually studies what is the best reconstruction you can get for a particular distortion. My understanding is that it has nothing to do with Gödel's arguments, or the two are very different. It's nothing to do with computability. It's only compressibility we are talking about. And the entropy h of x is for lossless compression. For lossy compression, there's an entirely different theory, rate distortion theory. So, yeah.
My name is Girisha. I'm a software engineer by profession. My question is to Mayank. It was very interesting to see the experiments that you did on the rat, wherein the behavior was same between the virtual reality and the real world, but the neuronal firings were very different. So my question to you is it the limitation of the virtual reality? It appeared as if the rat somehow knew in its brain that it was dealing with virtual reality, not really the real world. So was it the limitation of the way virtual reality was simulated, or supposing that there is a way to bring out exactly the real world scenario, but it's still a virtual reality, would the behavior would be different? Would you have a different result for the neuronal behavior?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So you have several questions, so let me try to answer all of them quickly. So first of all, that's why I think I gave the title that is there somewhere in the rat's brain information that even though his behavior seems to be the same to us, he somehow knows, whatever that meaning of the word is, he knows that he is in the virtual world. It's quite possible, but until we do an experiment to test it, we can't comment on it. So I'm agnostic whether he knows it's a different world or not. Now, we did a couple of things that go to some extent. So for example, we showed that in the virtual world, when the spatial map was completely lost, as soon as we made the paths predictable, so that his movement, such as acceleration, which is an internally generated cue, was consistent with something outside in the world, such as the scene he was seeing, instantly the map was recovered. It was of a different kind, but still the map was at least recovered. The neurons didn't seem to be lost. So the idea that I would suggest is that yes, it is indeed possible that this virtual reality rendering that we have goes only so far in making it real. And as we included more modalities such as smells and textures and sounds, then eventually it will be very hard for neurons at least to tell apart whether this is real or virtual. And if at the end sufficient number of neurons cannot tell apart it is virtual or real, then the whole animal will not be able to tell apart if it's virtual or real.
Thank you.
I'm Geshe Tojitamdi, the director of Tibet House, the culture center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama based in Delhi. So in fact, my question is not really directed towards any specific speakers. One of the speakers said that what is going in your mind and what you can see in the brain. So we see that we don't know what is going in your brain, but we do have so many experiences, and then how to correlate to. So in this connection, this prompted me to think about the title, the topic of this conference, consciousness, cognition, and culture. So it is a little beyond the brain. I think this is something which is so important, and particularly NIS organized this program. Consciousness, as to how to identify this consciousness, whether it is purely brain or whether it's slightly different from brain, what exactly is this consciousness. So this exploration, I think, is very important in case if consciousness it does not have any benefit whatsoever in our life, then this one thing, whereas in our life is very different. Say for example, say all the panelists here and all the participants here, they came all the way from all different places. Okay, there's such a very exciting program happening in NIS. So that brought us all here. So when we think like this, we don't know. We have not really seen the brain correlates, neural correlates. We did not see that. But then there's the obvious experience that drove us here. And then those people who are involved in corruption, people who are involved in, say, charity, and people who are involved in politics. Everyone is driven by some kind of thoughts going there, which is so prominent. And then how we define consciousness, it may differ from one tradition to another. It doesn't matter. But then the driving force, which we so obviously see, is there's something there which we could feel and which we don't see as a form of the brain waves or the neural correlates. And yet we can first-hand experience it, and that phenomena drives us all towards all kinds of activities. So therefore, I think this conference is directed towards looking for a correlate between the consciousness and the brain science or neuroscience. So I think all the participants, they make a great contribution. At the same time, if there's a way and a manner in which that this consciousness, exactly as to how is that defined? How is it defined from various traditions? One. Then number two, whether it really makes sense in a day-to-day life. Number two. Then in what way that makes that has a relationship with the brain. I think that some way it has to be addressed during this conference. Thank you. This was just a short comment. Thank you.
There was a wonderful book written by a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford called Languages of the Brain. And in that book he pointed out that there are this was 1960s work, but it's still used and it's still understood. There are 4 basic neuronal processes: self-inhibition, inhibition of self-inhibition, lateral inhibition, and the process which registers from what we
see on the brain cortex, say in the visual cortex when you're looking at a visual image, the process which registers that visual image in consciousness is called inhibition of lateral inhibition. This is effectively a linear transformation which transforms the localized information into holistic information. Now, this is absolutely basic knowledge, and basic, I thought, to the neurosciences, and it's very much developed in Ken Wilber's book, The Holographic Paradigm. But none of the work I've heard today seems to appreciate what I think is central to what our Tibetan reverend gentleman has told us, that basically, I believe you're saying, that consciousness is something with intentionality, it's a holistic function, and we're all still analyzing, inevitably, brain function in localized single cell or multi-cell units. And somehow we have to make the transformation between the two, and I would rather like to thank our colleague for directing our attention to, I think he was directing our attention to that dichotomy.
So I can speak to lateral inhibition. It's a highly nonlinear process actually, and we have written several papers on this. So for example, why is it that when the rat was walking around in the real world, you saw the code for absolute place, we could replicate it. But when he went into the virtual world, we never saw the code for absolute position, we saw the code for relative distance. On the other hand, when he was walking in the real world, we never saw the code for relative distance, we always saw absolute position. And what we have shown, not shown rather, what we have speculated, we still need to show, what we think is going on, that these two codes actually inhibit each other via lateral inhibition. So absolute position code fights the code for relative distance through lateral inhibition. And we believe it is through these specific types of interneurons called RLM interneurons, and we have a paper in 2007 in Nature Neuroscience where we looked at how they do this. So we have some ideas, but absolutely the inhibition plays a role, but I couldn't elucidate that in my 40 minutes.
Is this a distinction between the idea of where I am and some registration of where I actually am? When a great sportsman like Sachin Tendulkar or Novak Djokovic, has to make a stroke in his particular sport, he has a very clear idea of what to project onto his motor cortex. If you were to develop a model of free will, such as I happen to be working on, you have to be able to get a placement for an idea in the brain which goes before going to the motor cortex. You understand what I mean? It doesn't matter whether it's speech or hitting a tennis ball or walking across the street. It's what we all participate in. We have an idea of what we're going to do, which has to be at some place in the, presumably the cortex, or coupled to the cortex, and then that gets translated into an actual motor form. Does this make sense according to what you've said? This is the way consciousness connects to the outer world, isn't it?
I don't know. Because...
Nor do I.
He doesn't know that.
I don't know that. I can only say that I can only measure a few things, and I can mathematically understand those things. And until I can measure something precisely in laboratory with an instrument that doesn't depend on my language, such as discussion of consciousness, then I can't talk about it. It's interesting ideas worth discussing by far, and we should discuss them. But I believe that beyond those discussions we'll make tremendous progress only when we have a way to measure what a single neuron is doing. at the level of any of these questions such as consciousness, which can be like a galvanometer, you need a consciousometer or something like that. Otherwise, we can discuss it and we can have interesting ideas, including what people had for thousands of years, which are definitely very profound. But what we are trying to do is something slightly different, just to measure things.
One comment. Walter Freeman at Berkeley thinks that he sees self-organized criticality arising in the brain when the brain has a conscious thought. Now that's not localized in a single neuron, but it's a holistic pattern of structure within the firing of many neurons. I just leave that for you for a little thought. He's written many papers on the subject. Walter Freeman.
1/f self-organized criticality has been reported many, many times. It's well known that EEG has 1/f power spectrum, and that appears under all conditions, not just consciousness. In an anesthetized animal's brain, you have it. Now, we can argue whether an anesthetized animal is still conscious or not. That's where we go back to the question, can I measure consciousness? Then the discussion would go away, but it's an interesting thought. Please, you have something to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, that's a very difficult, the hard problem and difficult problem of consciousness, and I think the discussion would never end. Having said that, I think from what I understand of what the distinguished speakers have been addressing is to probably look at the basic unit of consciousness or conscious awareness, which is the perception of an external or an internal event, and trying to generate a signal which can be measured and which can be probably used for modeling, using appropriate models that you're talking about, and which can drive another computer, another device. So I think we are reaching there, but a long way to go, because ultimately neurons function as a unit, as a network, and then we are talking about systems, networks. I think we have a fair amount of distance to cover. I'm sure all these discussions would help us reach there.
Just to add to an intriguing piece of evidence, I mean, when you said consciousness at the global level, I think we're starting to get at that from a neuroscience point of view. For example, one correlate of consciousness is, for example, when a patient is going into, has anesthesia, and they're gradually slipping into unconsciousness. There's a surgeon who's done this experiment where they've asked the patient to be tapping their finger. So now the intention to tap has been conveyed to the motor cortex consciously, but as the patient is slipping into unconsciousness, at some point they stop the motor behavior. And what they observe in the brain, so they're recording from the brain at the same time, is that during the conscious behavior, there seems to be the prefrontal cortex seems to be desynchronized in the sense that it's not in a loop with the there's not an oscillation with the thalamus, but at the point where they stop tapping, then the prefrontal cortex goes into the same loop that all the other cortical areas are also going into the loop with the thalamus. It's similar to what I showed in my talk about in ECOG, where when you're resting, there's a slow oscillation between the motor cortex and the thalamus, but then when you that's the hypothesis anyway, and then when you make the movement, you have an increase in the firing rate of the local population of brain cells, but the low frequency oscillation gets suppressed. And the claim there is that the corticothalamic loop is essentially suppressed to allow the motor information to go through to the muscles, right, through the spinal cord and so on. So I think we're starting to get at a global picture, but it'll take time. But I think it's happening gradually. There's some glimpses of what we might call a theory, a neural theory of consciousness.
Good evening. I'm Lalit Saraswat. I'm doing my PhD at IIT Bombay, basically coming from biotechnology background to philosophy, and right now working on evolutionary perspective of consciousness and cognition. So I have two questions. First is about the empirically and computationally informed philosophical understanding of perception and reality. When we talk about the receptual similarity and perceptual similarity, when we talk about Mayank sir's experimentation, so I'm just trying to understand how the behavioral similarity and dissimilarity could be seen when the global saliency of the perception has to be understood in an animal or living systems. Because all living systems are anticipatory systems, and they predict something, as we've seen that the brains predict and the predictive coding is done. So I'm just curious to understand, because as we see that knowledge or the acquisition of knowledge has to have some sort of justification, as we see that Plato's JTB. So I'm just trying to understand how perceptual norms could be understood when we talk about this kind of empirically informed or computationally informed philosophical understanding of these kind of perceptions and reality and perceptions of reality also. So this is first question. Second question is regarding the predominance of neural doctrine. Because we see that there is glial cells also. There are glial cells which are, when we talk about single neuronal studies, we actually remove or neglect the glial cells which are all the time there helping, and the transduction and transmission of information is being done through them also. So I'm just trying to understand how this is there any problem which could be understood as a measurement problem, as we see in physics, quantum physics. So is there any problem which could be there to be seen when we talk about the neuronal responses and the behavior and the perceptions? Means I'm just trying to understand how this philosophically charged questions could be handled by the empirically or computationally informed analysis.
So it's indeed true that, so let me take the second question, which will answer your first question perhaps to some extent. So it's true that when I talked about this, I only talked about spikes from the soma. Clearly that's not the end of story. We know glial cells are important. In fact, we know glial cells play actually a crucial role in measurement of EEG. They influence synaptic plasticity. They influence even schlepping of all kinds of metabolites and other stuff across the brain. They play a role in what happens when you go to sleep. They play a role in clearing out metabolites. That has got to do something to do with learning and memory. So clearly those things are happening. And in fact, I skipped a whole bunch of things because I ran out of time. There's another big doctrine that we are not discussing, which is that we are focusing on the 10 micrometer soma of the neuron. The neuron is thousands of micrometers. And it's not even a neuron doctrine. What we should be calling for the last 100 years is the soma doctrine. It's what's happening at the soma that generates spikes. That's what we are focusing on. Not because we neuroscientists or who preceded us were stupid people. That's what could be measured. And the progress was made by measuring something we could measure, 1 or 100 or more neurons and so on. But now it's becoming possible to measure what's going on in dendrites. And we have done some of the measurements. Turns out they are doing some amazingly interesting stuff. They are generating their own spikes, which sometimes don't even reach the spikes in the soma. So there are many varieties of spikes that are going on. So clearly, when one talks about this discussion based on spikes from the soma, there is clearly a subtext to say this is not all that is going on. A lot more is going on. And as Rajesh was saying, that technology and math is coming together to answer these questions, how to separate stimulus in the physical world, neural response, perception, and then even more complex things. We are not there yet. We are simply talking about stuff we can measure clearly and talk about. That doesn't mean other things don't exist.
Right. So regarding the first question,
yeah, so there are ways one can do this and there are limitations. So once one wants to get into perception, clearly when you study animals, there is going to be severe limitation on what you call perception, because when you study a human being, there is a subjective response that we can relate to, which comes through language, which has certain novelty and details and complexity to it. When you ask an animal to do something, animal can press a lever to the left or to the right, or look left or right, and so on. That seems limited. But at the same time, technology is coming along where this is changing. So very quickly, we did an experiment where we measured simultaneously two different aspects of animals' behavior in virtual reality, which is possible because he's in the virtual world. So the only reason these guys are doing anything is because they're expecting a reward, such as all of us. The only reason we are sitting through listening to these talks is because there is some coffee or tea at some stage. Maybe, maybe not. But so what if, instead of simply measuring the movement of the rat's paws, which is what he's using to go somewhere, which is like some people placing a lever or moving left or right, we start to measure the response expectation, which is something else altogether.
Right.
So the licking tube that was in front of the rat, we started to measure. We put a little lick detector, and we could tell exactly when he licked that thing. Now, as a result of this new technology that has come along, instead of simply measuring the navigational map, we could also measure the reward expectancy map. Whenever they lick more often, they're expecting reward much more likely to be the case. And we discovered something really surprising that I cannot explain. What we found is that when the rat was told where to go based with only visual cues, which is the only part I discussed, the map which was hedonistic map, the map which based on licking, was perfectly in sync with the map of navigation. So two parts of the rat's body, one is navigation, other is reward expectation, were perfectly in sync. But if instead of the rat navigating with visual cues, we asked him to navigate using auditory cues, because we believe it's multisensory world. So we have these fancy multisensory cues. We turn off all the lights in virtual world and turn on all the sounds. Now, turns out that the navigational map was completely destroyed. So if you simply watch rat's paw movements and where he stopped and where he didn't stop, it seems he has no idea where to expect the reward or what to do. But if you measure where he is looking for reward, he has as good an idea about where the reward is as in the visual case. Which means, goes back to the perception, when you look at perception from the objective measurement point of view, different parts of the rat's body is expecting different perception, or rather reporting different perception. His tongue seems to say he knows where the reward is. His feet or paws are saying he has no idea where the reward is. So these questions become more interesting and harder to explain with time.
Thank you very much.
Will be addressable.
Thank you. I think
My name is Pankaj. I am from IIT Kanpur at philosophy discipline. I am reminded by Dr. Mehta's talk one old age problem of philosophy dates back to Descartes. Now it has been rephrased in brain in a vat scenario. That it is said that we all are brain in a vats filled with nutrients, and we are given electromagnetic impulses. That is how we have this sensuous experience. So I want to know if your theory or your research can be used to refute this skeptic argument, as you have shown that there is vast differences in the neural activities when a rat is roaming in a real world and when it is in virtual world. And you also pointed out through your running deer picture that the active part, the embodied part, the extended mind part, and the ecological cognition is as much important as the neural activities that goes in the mind.
That they, perhaps refutation might be a strong word, but they seem to point to a whole array of different kinds of answers, qualitatively different answers that one would not say refutes or supports it, but it's a different answer altogether.
Even I am also reminded of Alan Turing's approach, that strong intelligence and weak intelligence approach in robotics and computational science, that in 1950s it was supposed that we'll be able to generate a robot that would be as intelligent as we are. But in 2015 we are not able to even mimic the hand movement in robotics. So I think even Andy Clark is working in University of Edinburgh on embodied cognition. I think your research also implicates that embodied cognition is as much important as the computational part that goes around neural cognition.
And I don't think the two are kind of antagonistic or different. At the end, embodied cognition is one kind of computation.
But the approach is different. One is dualistic approach and one takes it as a whole.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Hello. I don't have a question, and if you regard it as a question, it's out of the context of you. I just want the answer in yes or no. Like, I've read the computational models too, like single neuron model, as you spoke about, or Huggins-Huxley model, or fuzzy model. Okay, I find them quite pragmatic or quite accurate, precise, but my question is whether they are like reliable. Like, you take Newton's law of motion, then when it came to Einstein they changed. when it came to quantum physics, they changed. So whether these models we are using for computational neuroscience, whether they're going to stick or whether they're going to change too.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in terms of modeling, you basically need to ask the question like, what is the model being used to understand, right? So the Hodgkin-Huxley model is a great model if you want to understand how action potentials are generated. It's a descriptive model, right? So it's basically a bunch of differential equations that will model how spikes are generated. And if that's what you want to understand and then do some experiments and verify its predictions, I mean, that's a great way to then use that model and then also test some of the predictions of the model in biology, right? On the other hand, if you want to understand perception, maybe that model is going to be not the level of detail you want to model. Maybe you want to model it at the level of like an integrated fire model, or maybe you want to even do firing rate models, like some of the ones that I did were firing rate models. So that would be a way to not go down to the level of individual channels and so on, but then you're actually using spikes as the mode of information transfer and so on, and that's it gives you the ability to model larger networks, larger numbers of neurons, and lets you understand a phenomenon at a different level, right? This is the phenomenon of behavior, maybe, right? So I think that each model has its own place in terms of understanding phenomena in biology, and yes, there are going to be newer models that might replace the older models, but I think what we have right now are a set of tools that help us answer questions at different levels of abstraction. And ultimately, I think as computers get faster, you're going to be able to maybe go down one level and start to implement more complicated models of very large networks, right? Some of the limitations are in terms of computational power, right? That you cannot model very, very large networks, and so then you're stuck with maybe a higher level of abstraction, simplifying details, maybe not modeling the dendrites and just modeling like single point neurons and so on. So I think it just depends on what question you want to answer, and then also what kind of computational power you have to simulate these models. And one last thing I'll add is these are bottom-up models that, like Hodgkin-Huxley. You can also come up with normative top-down models, like the predictive coding model is a normative model saying, let's assume the goal of the animal is to be efficient, right? Let's assume the goal is to minimize prediction error, right? Another example is, let's assume the goal of the animal is to maximize expected reward, right? So there you get into reinforcement learning and related theories. So those are normative models that might come from the top, so more of a artificial intelligence, robotics, computer science model. But you can dig deeper and say, can the neural systems implement it? And so then you can meet in the middle, right? You could say, okay, you can Hodgkin-Huxley type models implement the top-down normative model of reinforcement learning or predictive coding, right? So you could do that also, and that has also been done, and that leads to some interesting predictions you can test in biology.
My name is Giuseppe Vitiello. I'm a physicist. Well, I would like to spend one word for pacifying, because we had a couple of comments in some sense in disagreement with the methodology, namely the study of the single neuron, as it has been said, and on the other hand the study of consciousness or understanding of something most near possible to consciousness. I would say that we need both, because from one side we need what usually is called the naturalism. We need a collection of butterflies, of ores, of any sort of plants. We need to list. We need to know what does a single neuron, what does a single glia cell, what does more than 90% of water molecules, which are an essential part of the brain, because otherwise the brain does not work without that water. So we need to know that. However, that is not sufficient. This is the point. We need another part, the part that in physics you call the dynamics. Let me make a small example shortly. You could be, as a metaphor, you could be a crystal. Each one of you, in its own seat, is like an atom. You have some degree of freedom, you can move, you can read, you can stand up, and things like that. But you are an assembly. You are a set of people which goes beyond what is each one of you. We need to know who is each one of you. We need your data. We need to know what is your activity in your life outside of this room and so on. But we will not understand why you are here. And by the way, it's not true that we are here because we are waiting for the tea. Sorry for that. We are here because there is a long-range correlation which has brought us here. We were already companions in this adventure. And then we came here as a pilgrim to know something more. This is what we are. So such a long-range correlation is what we need to know, to understand what the brain does, how the brain functions. And this is what Walter Freeman, which has been mentioned before, and I'm glad to name his name because he is 90 this year, and he has been through working in neuroscience since 50 years maybe. He wants to understand the functioning of the brain, which is something else than the functioning of the single neuron. Moreover, the task of understanding the functioning of the brain is something which can go even slow, because it's not pushed by the industry or by the army, because they want robots to avoid workers or automatic soldiers to avoid the loss of people, and so riots in the country where the soldier would die. So we have a different necessity and different motivation. So we need both of them. And it's an ethical, quest, one of asking to putting together these two things. Because otherwise we will not have science. We will have from one side naturalists, and from the other side I don't know how to say, words, let's say, words in some sense.
Thank you so much, sir.
We need both of them.
Sir, thank you so much. In the interest of time, I think what you're saying is very important. I think in the interest of time, probably we may have to move on.
Yes, we have to move on to have the tea, because we are here also for the tea. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think we have a couple of more questions, and then I think we will wind up for the day. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Sunanda Deshmukh, an anesthesiologist from Florida. I'm Sunanda Deshmukh. Can you hear me? I'm an anesthesiologist from Florida. I have a question for Dr. Rao. You mentioned about asking a patient to move his finger as he was going to under anesthesia. Now there is a technique called conscious sedation anesthesia, and in that the person is asleep because of the medication, and at that stage he will stop moving the fingers, but he is still conscious. If you call their name, they will wake up. So just the fact that he stopped moving finger does not mean that patient was unconscious. Also, my husband is a neurologist, and he tells me that there is a phenomenon called thalamic cat, in which if the lesion is above the thalamus, the cat acts like a normal conscious cat, and unless the lesion is below the thalamus, it does not become unconscious. So it is possible that the neurological level of consciousness is in the hypothalamic region.
No, I think I guess it comes down to, in terms of the definition of consciousness, right? So there's different definitions. I guess if you want to start probing the different definitions of consciousness, I think what you mentioned is a good example of how, you could be under sedation, but then you're not, what you would call unconscious, but then maybe you can wake up. And so I think there's really one can tease apart the potential, definitions of what one means by consciousness through this technology, maybe through this idea of anesthesia as a way to sort of induce different levels, and then looking at measuring the brain simultaneously, right? So I think that's what is happening now in human neuroscience. Is we are getting access to parts of the brain in human patients as they're going into anesthesia, and that's what I think is going to be quite valuable as we build up neural theories of what it means, for a person to be conscious of particular aspects of reality, right? So I think what you pointed out is a good example of how this particular methodology might help us in the future. Mike?
Yeah, the idea of surprise is an interesting one. It's known that hippocampal neurons respond differently in face of novelty versus familiar stimuli. So we checked for that. That was indeed something we checked, and we ran animals with different degrees of experience in virtual reality. Real world, of course, they have experience, perhaps even through evolution and genetics, but in virtual world, the number of neurons that dropped did not change, whether they had a little bit of experience or a lot of experience. We don't think that's the answer.
Okay, let's have the final two questions. One from that side. You've been waiting. Okay.
Hi, my name is Konzan Pereira. I'm an independent researcher. My question is to all the panelists. It's in regards to a case called as hydroencephaly, where the brain is not formed and only 1 mm of the brain is attached to the skull. Now, usually children who are detected with this disorder are terminated, but there are cases where the children are born and they might not demonstrate cognition, but of course they are conscious. So, can you comment on that?
I've heard that there are 1 million neurons in the spinal cord, for example. So I don't know whether that has some thing to do or.
It's a congenital anomaly, and this is usually not compatible with long life. And then in the rare instances wherein they are born alive, they usually succumb to their primary genetic problem.
Yeah.
And you are asking about what is the level of consciousness in such individuals. Of course, you would have different levels of consciousness, and they are not capable of going up the higher levels of consciousness, but they would never live long enough to tell us their private experiences, because they usually do not survive for much longer. Can we move on to
even if they live for a year, they still smile. So they definitely are aware and they experience. So without a brain, how is that possible? Because the skull is only filled with cerebrospinal fluid.
Quite difficult questions to answer. Hopefully, I think we'll carry on with the discussion subsequently. So let's have the final question of the day.
Hello, my name is Akash. I'm a student in Indian Institute of Science. My question is specific to Dr. Rajesh. Like when you talk about the reinforcement learning, the learning happens after many iterations. And for example, like in deep learning, you need many examples, plus the algorithm converges after many iterations. But in case of humans, like the learning, there are two types of learning. Like there's one instant learning, like you see the image, like I see a person, I recognize his face. And there's some kind of learning which happens over a duration, like for example, learning for an exam. So do you have any idea, do you have any knowledge why that happens? Like why is that one instant learning and learning which happens over a duration?
Yeah, I think that's a great question also in terms of human learning, right? So there's multiple models that have been explored in the computational neuroscience community, and reinforcement learning is one example that was quite successful in predicting like dopamine responses in the brain, because that was related to something called a prediction error, like a temporal difference prediction error in the reinforcement learning. Basically, you're expecting a reward and then you don't get it, then you get a negative error, whereas if you're not expecting a reward and you get the reward, that's a positive prediction error. And so using the reward prediction error, you can change your behavior, and that is the reinforcement learning approach. But like you said, it requires a lot of experience with the world, right? You have to keep interacting. If it's a rat in a maze, they have to keep learning. So like what Mayank showed were the results of training the rat for many days, right? I don't know how many days it was trained, but it'll be for several days before they can learn the task and then figure out how to get the reward, and that changes what is called the policy of the animal, right? So that kind of learning happens in the animal world and even in humans, and we might be learning to play tennis or table tennis, through the trial and error kind of learning, and that's every time we score a point in table tennis, we might say, okay, I'm going to reinforce that, and right. So that happens, right? Similarly, what you said was one-shot learning. That's a different kind of learning, and that's something that
people have just tried to model recently, but again using this Bayesian type of model. And the idea there is the hierarchical Bayesian model, which is that multiple levels where the higher levels are trying to model the parameters of the lower levels. And so I might have learned, for example, how to pick up this cup, right, with a particular number of reinforcement learning kind of phenomenon, but then maybe I can use whatever knowledge I learned to transfer that knowledge of that one particular phenomenon to another one and not have to do the same thing 1,000 times with that, right? So people have shown that children, for example, can be modeled quite well in terms of how quickly they learn, in terms of one-shot learning, using this hierarchical Bayesian model. So there's some work done by Josh Tannenbaum at MIT that you can look at that models it in that way. So you require a different model from reinforcement learning, but yeah, it is just starting to be addressed. The neural correlates are not yet known for how that might happen, but it's definitely a up-and-coming area.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of a very exciting and very fruitful session, and indeed a very fruitful day of very good scientific deliberations. I thank all the speakers for their wonderful presentations and for very patiently taking all the questions and giving us more information from from their experiences. And I thank all the audience for the wonderful participation. And
thank you, Dr. John. Just a few announcements. Please know that the poster session is as important as the rest of the sessions we saw for the day. So please don't conclude the day with this session. Please encourage our young scholars who have taken a lot of trouble in making this poster. So the poster session is just in the next building, and you would see that it's very easy, just a few steps. So please don't miss it. And it starts at 6 o'clock, maybe after a 15-minute break, and then there would be some warm cup of coffee and tea at 6:30, and perhaps don't miss that too. Tomorrow again we have the session starting at 9:30, so please try to be here at time. And tomorrow there is there's an evening lecture by Professor Georg Nothoff. I'm sure you would have noticed that from the timetable. And then there is an evening cultural program which we are putting up with the help of a very talented group of artists who are in Bangalore. And it was very difficult to get them, so I hope you won't miss that too. And the third day too, we have an evening lecture by Professor V.N. Jha on a philosophical approach to understanding mind and consciousness. Miguel Nigolalis, unfortunately the lecturer is not here because at the last minute, due to some unforeseen reasons, he couldn't be here. And on 12th December, there would be a concluding session or a concluding symposium of this 3 days event, which is on reality in modern physics and classical traditions. And I hope you all will be attending that fascinating symposium as well. So please make these events in your calendar, and I hope you won't miss them. So perhaps after a 15-minute break, or you can already move in there, but I think the session would start formally at 6 o'clock at the atrium of the faculty building. Thank you very much.